1970 was not a great year for Chevrolet as Ford bested in sales, in part due to a prolonged strike at General Motors assembly plants. However, in 1971, Chevrolet also ran second to Ford before regaining the sales crown in 1972. And at General Motors, the full-size vehicles were all new for 1971, including the Chevrolet Caprice and Impala. The new for 1971 vehicles were longer, lower, and wider than their predecessors, with the new for 71 Caprice riding atop a 121.5-inch wheelbase versus the 119-inch wheelbase from the 1970 version. It also gained a bit in heft, going from a curb weight of around 3,900 pounds up to about 4,100 pounds in the 1971 model year. But the largest change for the 1971 models over the 1970 was the styling, and it was so different over the 1970 model that the brochure proclaimed, "You've changed, we've changed." The brochure went on to specify, "We've changed our thinking and come up with what is probably the most inexpensive, expensive car ever built anywhere, our 1971 Caprice." Chevrolet had often appropriated Cadillac styling cues to give its cars a bit more up-level flair despite their relatively low price points. And the 1971 Caprice was no exception. Up front, the egg crate grille was pure Cadillac, although the egg crates were a bit bigger than what was typically seen on a number of Cadillacs of the era. And the front dome-shaped hood also had more than a passing resemblance to Cadillacs of the era. But the best element of the styling was really saved for the rear of the car, where Chevrolet continued on the coupes the concave rear curved glass that started on the 1969 lineup, and did so in a very handsome way. The rear of the car also showed off GM's new for 1971 flow-through ventilation system, which employed these louvers in the trunk lid to exhaust in-cabin air. When coupled with a continuously operating fan inside the car, this flow-through ventilation system was designed to provide fresh air into the cabin at all times, even when the car was stationary. It was a good idea on paper, and really the next evolution of flow-through ventilation systems that GM cars and other makes had employed in the 1960s. It did have one major problem, though, that despite the continuously operating low-speed fan, in some particular instances, exhaust could be drawn back through the trunk into the passenger cabin, risking asphyxiation of the passengers inside. Thus, the flow-through ventilation louvers were dropped from all GM trunk lids after the 1971 model year, and you'll note in this 1972 Caprice, there are no louvers in the rear. Interiors were also all new for the 1971 model year, and Chevrolet went to this new dashboard, which I think looked admittedly a bit cheaper than the outgoing 1970 models. And interestingly, the midsection in front of the driver was always black, including the steering wheel, likely a cost-cutting move in an effort to save a few dollars. Many of the controls were easy to read. However, the climate control and radio controls were hidden a bit by the steering wheel and required considerable reach if you had the seat in a far back position. The dash pads were also made from a material that wasn't overly durable and often were subject to significant cracking. These cars also introduced for Chevrolet the radio antenna in the front windshield, which had its good and bad attributes. Some people complained of the overall reception from the radio as a result of these antennas, but others liked the fact that they didn't have to lower their antenna or remember to do so prior to going into a car wash. Caprice buyers could choose from myriad options, including Chevrolet's Comfortron automatic temperature control setup that not only controlled temperature automatically, but also fan speed and air mode door activation. It was a relatively good setup, if not a bit troublesome, especially in these early years. There were 3 engine choices for the 1971 Caprice. The standard engine was the 400 cubic inch small block Chevrolet, outfitted with a 2-barrel carburetor making 255 horsepower. It was a very smooth power plant and the largest cubic inch displacement of all of Chevrolet's small block engines. Next up was the 402 cubic inch big block turbojet V8 making 300 gross horsepower. And despite this being a completely different engine than the 400 small block and displacing 402 cubic inches, for some reason Chevrolet in their marketing brochures decided to call it a 400, and enabled the buyer to confuse himself or herself with the small block engine. Not sure why they would do that, but they did. The top dog engine was the turbojet 454 cubic inch big block outfitted with a 4-barrel carburetor, making 365 horsepower. Unfortunately, while the 1971 Chevrolets had gained a bit in weight, 1971 was also the first year where General Motors switched all of its engines to running on no lead fuel. This meant that all engines were relatively low compression compared to those that were manufactured in 1970 and previous model years. For 1972, much about the Caprice stayed the same, except it got a very different front end, now sporting Chevrolet's twin-port theme that would later be picked up by stylists in the 2000s era on the Chevrolet Malibu and other Chevrolet vehicles. Out back, the curved backlight remained for the coupes, but the trunk louvers were gone after the 1971 model year. And to my mind, this 1972 Caprice is one of the best-looking cars of the 1970s, and certainly one of the best in the General Motors stable. Unfortunately, while the exterior styling was perhaps more handsome than the 1971 models, under hood, the engines saw a significant decrease in horsepower, in part due to the industry's shift to SAE net horsepower ratings, which rated engines with the air cleaner, accessories, and full exhaust systems, as opposed to SAE gross horsepower ratings, which rated engines horsepower without any of those items. Vehicle emission standards were also tightened for 1972, leading to lower horsepower ratings. Regardless, the standard engine remained the 400 cubic inch small block V8 with a 2-barrel carburetor making 170 horsepower. Optional was again the 402 big block, sporting a 4-barrel carburetor and making 210 net horsepower. This time again called the 400 V8, again to confuse potential buyers. And the top dog was a 270 horsepower 454 cubic inch V8. Interestingly, this top dog 454 cubic inch V8 was actually the most powerful big block that one could get in a General Motors full-size vehicle. The Olds and Buick big blocks of this era were making about 225 horsepower with single exhaust, 250 horsepower with dual exhaust, and the Cadillac 472 and 500 cubic inch V8s were making 220 and 235 net horsepower respectively. While all these horsepower ratings may seem relatively low by today's standards, I can tell you from having driven many of these cars that even a Caprice powered by a small block 400 with a 2-barrel carburetor making just 170 horsepower does not feel like a slouch in any respect if you're driving around town. Certainly if you're trying to pass on the freeway at 70 or 80 miles an hour, it's run out of steam. But as you drive around in city traffic, the car feels peppy and like there's a lot more horsepower under hood than what the rating suggests. Also, from an ownership standpoint, I can say that these Caprices are relatively reliable vehicles, although they do have a bit more jiggly bodies than the previous generation, which often drove much more like they were made from a billet of steel. Lastly, I will say that if you're looking to procure a Caprice from this era, that you be sure to check the trunk pan as well as the area around the rear window for rust. For whatever reason, these 1971 to 76 GM cars seem to be particularly prone to rusting out at the bottom of the back window, which then releases water into the trunk when you go through a car wash or it's raining. So be very careful of that. Regardless, these 1971 and 72 Caprices are some of the best-looking GM cars of the early 1970s, and indeed maybe in the whole industry. They are very handsome, tasteful, and a lot of the styling cues were rediscovered later on when Chevrolet reinvigorated the twin-port grille on some of its cars in the early 2000s, as I previously mentioned. In any case, thanks again for watching this video. Until next time, take care. Thanks for watching this video on the 1971 and 72 Caprice. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Feel free to check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and bottom right for some suggestions for you. Until the next time, thanks again for watching.